Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And you're back in your normal place. You're back in Spain.
Yeah, I'm back in Spain now, out of hotels and the road. And the best part about it was I figured out that I don't need a hip replacement. I figured this out on the road when I saw Dr. Steve Ballinger, who could examine me up close and personal, despite my primary care physician saying, "Oh, yeah, I think you need." He's a surgeon. He's an orthopedic surgeon. And he says, "You don't need it. You have sciatica."
Oh, interesting.
Which can be cured with stretching, reformers, Pilates, and cortisone. So I am glad I do not have to go under the knife for that.
That is excellent news because you've been under the knife enough lately. We both
both knees, the elbow, the heel, the first one you remember, of course, was the appendix. So I'm glad that. Yeah,
I remember that. That was in the day. All right. Today we are going to talk about accountability or the lack thereof. This is episode 76, the accountability show. And I mean, anyone that opens any news feed, any publication recognizes that people do bad things. And many of the people that do bad things are not held accountable. And we're not talking about the news so much as what do you do if that's your situation at work? What if you work in a place where other people are not held accountable and it is impacting your ability to do your job? So that's today's topic.
Yep. Yeah, it could be. But listen, I've had the occasion to tell this story, and I've been thinking about it more because it has a moral dimension to it. In high school, I'm working in a fast health food restaurant, and presumably because we cared about people's health, a woman shows up one day. She was a chemist, and she said, "Listen, I need to tell you something. If you mix, you just served me this. And it's tomato on styrofoam. It creates a toxic, poisonous solution when they're mixed. You can already see it in your plate. This plate." And she proffered her plate, and you could see that it was starting to disintegrate. And I thanks for letting me know. I rushed back into Howard, the manager's office, and say, "Listen, this chemist was here. She just said that these plates, when mixed with citrus, tomatoes, lemons, like we do, can cause a toxic thing. It'll hurt people. It'll make them sick, or maybe die in some cases." And he just sat there and stared at me. And I said, "So I think you should know, kind of." And he's like, "Oh." I said, what should we do?" He goes, "I got a stockroom full of them. What do you think I'm going to do? Get back to work." So which puts me, I'm 16 years old, but I understood there are moral dimensions to this. Do I have to, I don't have any other plates to give people, what am I going to do? And that was the point at which I decided I'm either working on the register or delivering, or business is slow. I would go out into the streets and hand out flyers that I would not put food on those plates. And it was easy enough to do. Of course, that's sidestepping responsibility because if I see people eating off those plates, tomatoes and lemons, they're going to get sick. But at 16, that was, I think, the most I could muster. In other words, if you're working for a boss who's not held to accountability, and leaving is not an option, I don't know that you have there's scant possibilities for what else you can do.
Well, and we wanted to examine this from a couple of different places, right? One, from obviously the perspective of a worker. Looking at accountability for others is very different than a boss or a leader. So let's start with the worker. And one of the first cases is, if something is happening at your workplace and someone else is doing something that's immoral or unethical or dangerous to the organization as a whole, that actually does put you in a position of some power. And again, we always say this, like, be careful if you need your job. You don't want, use caution when trying this at home. But what I have found is that if there is something that is clearly unethical or illegal, to try to capture that information and get it to whoever it is that you can trust and show the business case of this happening, right? So for example, and again, totally understand at 16, that's not necessarily something you could do, but in that circumstance, a 16-year-old could potentially now take some pictures, interview the chemist, do a little research, put it on social media or put it on Yelp, right? Like, get it out into the world in a review. There are options. I think, one of the things that I've done in, my long career in advertising is I've seen a lot of sexual harassment. And one of the things that I tried to address was, the moral framework is not germane to many leaders and business owners, unfortunately, but the risk of litigation is. So what I would say is if you continue to do this behavior, you are at risk of someone suing you. Is that something that we can afford? Is that a PR that you want to have out in the world? Right. So there is a case where if someone is not being held accountable for something that is illegal, immoral, or could impact the organization as a whole, that is probably your strongest suit. But what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to be able to capture that information. Like you need to have proof, and you're probably going to need to go. I'm assuming that the person lacking accountability is in some sort of leadership role and you work for that person or in that chain. You're going to have find somebody to go above their head. Right. And there is a risk to that.
Yep. Now, those are three very distinctly different categories. There's overlap, but moral, ethical, and illegal are very different. What do you do if you discover? And for me, my answer is very readily apparent. What do you do if you discover your boss is having an affair with a non-coworker? You just happen to see them somewhere, and it's like, oh my gosh, that's my boss, and that's not his wife, and they're kissing. In my mind, I think that falls under none of your business. But
again, it's the last part of that phrase: immoral, ethical, or dangerous to the organization as a whole. Right. So that does not impact, presuming that this person who's having the affair is not exploiting their power differential with the person that works for them, which is a big assumption. But assuming that it's two consenting adults that are doing something that you as the viewer and an individual might find to be reprehensible or immoral, does it damage the company as a whole? Does it put other people at risk? Now, if this is a man who has a pattern of having extramarital affairs with young women who are interns or assistants, then that's not just immoral and unethical. It also places the organization at danger, right? So I think part of it is looking at the organization, but I also think too, you have to look at your own ethical and moral standards, right? You have to live with yourself. And if you have a spiritual practice or an ethical framework that precludes certain behaviors, then you probably ought to listen to that. You worked for Epstein in the day and knew what was happening. You made an ethical and moral choice every day.
Yep. Yeah, there have been cases, if you've read through some of the files, where some of the housekeepers who had left were fired and were angry, like people do who are separated from their jobs sometimes, and they took a bunch of stuff with them. And the stuff they took were CDs, DVDs, and thumb drives. And the intent was not to blackmail, but the intent was to see some sort of justice done. And I think if I understood what I was reading correctly, that Epstein, of course, did pay for these to get them back. It was written by a woman's son who realized the full gamut of what was going on, and then subsequently reported him to the FBI, and of course, nothing happened.
I want to acknowledge that the reason that this seemed interesting to us was because of what's happening or not happening for people who participated in Epstein and Maxwell. She gets credit too. Their sex trafficking and pedophilia ring, and I think we have to name that a lot of us that are faced in circumstances where people are not being held accountable, particularly people in power, are going to maybe be activated. We're going to maybe feel more sensitive to it. And I think we have to name that, right? Another thing you can do at work, if you want to address this and you have somebody who isn't accountable, is to look at, is it limiting your ability to do your job in a quantifiable way, right? So I was thinking of the example of somebody who has a drinking problem and is not able to show up on Mondays after a long weekend drinking, or shows up in a way that is limited, right? So
not helpful. Yep.
Yeah. So if you work for someone named Ellen who has a drinking problem and can't do her job on Mondays, and Ellen is constantly shifting her work to you or to other team members, you can name that is impacting your ability to do the job. Now, what I would suggest that you do is you have proof and you name it in a way that is neutral to your boss or supervisor or HR, although we have always said HR is not your friend. But you name it in a way that I know that you want these reports done by noon on Monday. It is challenging for me to do those because for the last 6 weeks, Ellen has asked me to do all of her customer service reports also on Monday morning. How would you like me to proceed?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm smiling because I'm remembering a New York City office job that I had where I'm always been a dutiful employee. Show up early, on time, stay late, get the job done. And every day I would ask what to do. And finally, I'm a quick study. It took me about 5 days to realize that my job was to cover for my boss who had a drinking problem. He would come in the office, or not after he realized certain things. He would not come in the office, and he was concerned about his boss who had a gambling problem. So it was the whole system relied on my silence and ability to cover for both of these guys. My direct boss would call and say, "Did Simonian call?" And I'd say, "He hasn't called." He goes, okay. And you could hear the bar in the background. He would go back to drinking, and if somebody called, it called and said, "Is Simonian there?" I go, "He just stepped out. This was my job." Outside of that first week, I didn't see either of those guys in the office for 3 months. Now, I felt sort of complicit in a horrible system. So the New York City Department of Parks, but I was a college student. This was a summer job for which I was getting paid a lot of money. So sometimes I'm making a parallel to the Epstein thing, sort of, because it benefited me my being accountable to their unaccountability benefited me in the long term. I published a magazine that summer. I applied for, a Guggenheim. I did a lot of stuff. I was very busy, but I wasn't doing that.
See, I think
ethical, legal. Well, legal, yes. It was not ethical.
But I think that there is something to be said for being a worker among workers, right? Like work. I've had friends tell me this because I am such a workaholic. Work as hard as everyone else at the job.
Right.
Right? If everyone else at the job leaves at 3 o'clock, leave at 3 o'clock. If everyone else at the job does 50% of their assigned tasks, do 50% of your assigned tasks. I think where the accountability issues come in is not where everybody's slacking off and you decide you're not going to overfunction and fix everything for everybody. That's a different case. And I think you were a worker among workers. You worked as hard as your bosses did, right? And I think that's a different scenario than when you are in a workplace. Like what chaps my hide is if I am in a workplace and I am working hard, other people are working hard, and we have to work that much harder because a person or people are not doing their job effectively or are not doing their job at all. Right. And I think that's what I'm thinking about is like, basically it's how do you hold somebody accountable? Right. And I think, again, if you have some way of quantifying the impact of that person's lack of performance on your ability to do your job or your team's ability to reach their goals, you have to make it about the bottom line. That's the only way that you are going to get, and you might not get accountability for the other person, but you might get, for example, something else taken off of your plate. Because I think the key thing here, which we miss a lot in these circumstances, is to name them, to say it out loud, even if you are a worker and you are not a leader and don't have a lot of power, to just say something like, all right, so let me just understand, Jim, you said that you would have this done on Tuesday. It's now Friday.
Yeah. Well,
long pause. When can we expect that from you? Long pause, right? You can name it. Oh, Ellen, I see that you are asking me to take over all of your duties on Monday again. Which of the existing projects that I already have on my plate would you like to take from me?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, you can do it in a way that's professional, but saying it out loud. So you're asking me to. So what you want to do is. So, just to sort of state it can be helpful. But I think the challenge is a lot of situations that I've been in are where there is a lack of accountability and I can't quantify it. I can't prove it. I can't take it to HR. I just know it's happening, and it's not so much that it's impacting my ability to do my job or putting the organization at risk. It's just pissing me off.
Yeah.
And those are the circumstances that I think are most challenging.
I had the occasion when I was working at Apple to go to Apple Japan. I was working on a series of articles in Asia, and Japan was stopped. I get into the Apple office, and it was a Japanese microcosm. Like, all of the men in the office were doing nothing. Like, it was like they had watched a TV show about Silicon Valley, and they were doing their level best to imitate that TV show. So they were kind of sitting around pontificating in Japanese, so I didn't understand what they were saying. My Japanese is very limited. So they were pontificating, and the women in the office were absolutely like, Scirocco's of productivity, but they were harried, right? So they're going, and I finally figured these women are working super hard because they're doing two jobs. These guys who are sitting there pontificating and their jobs. And so I was there to do a series of articles. I did this series of articles. I got back to California, and they said, "How was it?" And I said, "Listen, I think I need to let you guys know what's going on in the Japanese office." And I unloaded on those guys. And then, of course, I got a job at Adobe like a week later, so I left. So I never found out if the other shoe dropped. But I have never been more desirous to see a room of people fired than those guys.
And what do you think the chances are that a shoe dropped?
You know what? Apple was weirdly responsive in certain specific ways. And this is going back to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, there's lots of documentation that supports this idea of Steve Jobs being an asshole, but he was a very specific kind of an asshole. If his world was broken down into A-list players and people he could abuse. And if you were not an A-list player, or you were a soft A-list player, like there's a guy who worked for him. I'm not going to say his name. He reminded me of Barney Rubble. And that guy was very good at marketing, but he didn't have any, you quantify how good. So Steve routinely abused him in public ways. But most of the A-list players, he was very great to. So it depends. I don't know. I told a couple of people, and it depends on whether it benefited them to whether they were at war with somebody at Apple Japan. But I really want to know. And I was hoping to God they got rid of some of those guys, because that was the most egregious example I've seen of people getting paid top dollar and doing absolutely nothing. Right. I used to joke. I say, if you get paid to mop, but you do no mopping, you're a rich man. And that office was full of rich men.
Right. So, who did not mop. Well, and what I found to, manage those circumstances where there's no accountability, and so I do not eat out my heart with rage and fury, is to really look at a couple of things. Like, one is to take the long view. I didn't know this when I was in my 30s, but I know it in my 60s, which is business karma is real, and it too is a bitch. Right. Yep. And it was mostly men, but there were women in there too who did horrible things and were not held accountable. They're not working anymore. And some of them were not able to work well before retirement age. Like, they just couldn't get hired. Right. And either people found out about it or their general incompetence crept up. And so that has happened many, many times. People that just plagued me, that I thought, like, why are you still, coursing across the firmament of this particular industry, are like, oh, haven't seen him for a decade. And yet I am still here. I think also, it's important for me to recognize, like many things at work, this is a self-regulation issue. Right. So, like, is this a solvable problem? Is it solvable by me? And if not, then what can I do? Right. And so recognizing that right now I am particularly attuned to stories of malfeasance perpetrated by powerful white men who are not held to account. Do I need to recognize that that's part of my emotional reaction? And again, still realize that I can still go. Right. Like leaving a job because it creates a difficult emotional ecosystem for you for whatever reason is absolutely a valid choice. But if you have to stay in the job, if you can't solve the problem, pick your emotional battles. Like I just would say to myself sometimes when I was dealing with somebody who was really difficult and not held to account, he has to go home. And often these were people who were deeply unhappy at home. Very few of these men who were not held accountable, who did horrible things, went home to loving spouses and happy children, right? Often they went home to addiction and people who didn't particularly care for them, or that's what turned out. Why are you laughing?
Because our worldviews are so very different. You said he has to go home, and what I heard is you got to leave that building sometime. Yeah. I'll get you in the parking lot. Yeah. But that came from an actual story. A guy I knew who was a corporate detective. In other words, he would get hired by security companies to get hired by companies that were having, equipment loss problems, and essentially he was a paid snitch. And one guy really hated his boss, but my friend who was a detective also hated this guy because he said the guy was a racist piece of garbage. So one day when he's leaving, he sees, this is in a warehouse setting for like Home Depot. He sees the guy who he was about to write up for smoking weed creeping on the catwalk above, the pallets of products with a brick, following the racist boss out into the parking lot. And he was like, should I say something? And he was like, nah. And of course, the boss got hit with a brick and was out for a couple of weeks. And I said, well, how was he when he came back? He said, he was a lot nicer when he came back. So I don't advocate hitting somebody with a brick, but at the same time, this.
But I think,
yeah.
There's also ways. I mean, you are a person who could follow someone out to a parking lot. I am not, but it doesn't mean that like I haven't had an opportunity. I mean, I told this story before, but like a woman who's particularly horrible to me and not held to account applied for a job at a place where I was in leadership. And the president of the company said, should we interview her? And I just said, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all I said. I didn't say anything else. And he trusted me. So she did not get an interview. So again, karma will come around. But I want to spend a few minutes just talking about what to do if you're a boss, right? Mm-hmm. If you are a leader and you have a culture where people are not being held accountable, or you're not making goals because fundamentally people are not being held accountable, it's an entirely different thing. Right. And so what I try to do if I have a client as an executive coach who's in that circumstance is to first say, is there something that the individual leaders or executive group is doing to perpetuate this culture of a lack of accountability? Because one of the things that I think is if you run a company and it is fucked up in any way, you own that. It is on you. Right? Whether it is your personal failing or your just failure to address something. And so the first thing that an individual who runs a place where there's a lack of accountability needs to do is own your part, right? Are you conflict avoidant? Do you have inefficiencies in leadership, right? Because what should happen for accountability is people should know what their jobs are and they should understand how their success is judged. Everybody should have key performance indicators or KPIs or a goal, either as a team or individuals, and then they should be held to account. That being held to account can be achieved by carrots and sticks. Right? So if you do well, you get a bonus, a promotion, training, something. And if you do not perform, there is a stick. You get demoted, you get put on a personal improvement plan, you lose your job, you no longer are a manager. If people see that those who are doing their jobs are rewarded and those who are not doing their jobs are schooled in some way, they will start being accountable. And what that does is it changes the tenor of the entire organization. Right. And you would think it's pretty simple, right? Like people know their roles, people know what success looks like. They're given the tools that they need to be successful. And then those that succeed are rewarded and those that do not are dealt with. But it is amazing to me how many organizations can't get that simple series of things in place.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a great line spoken by Jello Biafra on this Fear Power God spoken word compilation thing that I put out years ago. And it resonated with me over the years. And he's just asking this rhetorical question, which is, how reckless can you get? How reckless can you get? I've seen multi-billion-dollar companies that I'm acquainted with, Brobeck, Flager, and Harrison, this one of California's biggest law firms that had offices in New York on like 45th Street, just go belly up, just with a series of just bad decisions that double down into worse decisions. And so it's not always reasonable to expect people to do the reasonable thing, because we're people, I guess, right? So
right. So did you have a fire me?
Yeah, I did. There was a death recently of a friend, a close friend, and I mean, like in the last 3 days. And
I'm sorry.
Somebody was wanting to go to the funeral, but they had exceeded the number of PT. I think the first quarter they had used the days for something else. I don't know what. And there was some sort of implication that they would be sanctioned or punished for attending the funeral. And they asked me, and I didn't know the answer, is there a legal standing for needing to go to funerals if the person is not a blood relative? So I'd put it to the show, because I have no idea, actually.
Is there, were they, like, how much time did they have to take off to go to the funeral? Was it like, I need to fly to Europe and it's going to be a 5-day thing? Or was it, I need to drive down the street to a local, religious center?
No, I'm in Florida and I have to go to California to go to this funeral.
Right.
So what I'd like is, Thursday off to attend the funeral on Friday, and I'll be back in the office by Monday.
I mean, I think this is, I have no idea about the legal basis. And if you do, write us, WTF@badbossbrief.com, and we will tell you on our next episode. But I think that most places who have paid time off should have the flexibility for people to choose to take time off without compensation. Mm-hmm. Because, that whatever the legal ramification is, you should have that as an option. It sucks, but presumably if this guy wants to go to the funeral enough that he's willing to not get paid for 2 days. And again, I don't recommend that. I think you should give people bereavement leave. And but it also goes to another weird cultural thing. Like, I've seen these bereavement policies that get very granular about, like, you get, a week for a parent, spouse, or child. You get a day for some other, there's just these very weird kind of grief algorithms that are not helpful. And the reality is that, I am closer to my aunt than I ever was to my mother. So, if it, should my aunt pass away, I would be impacted the way other people might be impacted if they lost their mother. Whereas when my mom died, I was like, oh, okay. I mean, we've talked about this in other places. And so I do think that there's two things. Like, one, just from a retention standpoint, anybody in HR or anybody in leadership should say, if you have used all of your PTO and you have something, you can absolutely take time off without pay. Which also insulates you from someone abusing that by having every relative they know pass away and needing to take PTO and get an exception. But presumably, if someone is motivated enough to forego their pay, then you should respect that, right?
Yep.
For sure. And I think also recognizing the kind of cultural tendency to assign value to people's grief in ways that are really dehumanizing. Like, we don't know what kind of bonds someone has, right? We don't know. I mean, friendship can mean somebody that I get to, see at the bar when I go to get a beer a couple times a month. Or it can be like my friend, Mary Virginia, who I've been friends with since we were 12 years old. And we talk every day and have since we were in our 20s, right? I mean, that's like closer than many people are to siblings. Right. And so I think we need to just be mindful as a culture that, like, let's just not judge other people's grief. And if somebody needs to go to a funeral to honor their loved one, their family, their connection, let them go to the fucking funeral.
Yep. Messages for bosses: let them go to the funeral. Seriously, I don't understand being that hard-hearted, but I'm not on your financial system. I don't know what events are caught. Who knows? Maybe there's a bona fide reason that this person needs that Thursday for you to be in the office, but I can't see it.
But this is the thing too that's so frustrating: is there's this real immature approach, and I hear this all the time. Well, it's not fair, right? It's not fair if one person gets this exception and another person gets this exception. And it's like, that is a very immature and usually not helpful rule by which to run a business that is comprised of a multitude of people with varying needs. Right. All right. Well, so that's what we've got time for. If you have any ideas for future shows and topics, I always appreciate those. Or if you have any questions like Eugene just posited about work, bad bosses, or something you would like to do to survive the corporate world, please get in touch. WTF@badbossbrief.com. I read every single email and respond to anything that isn't a sales pitch. So we'd love to hear from you. See you in a couple weeks. Thanks.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your host, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Payrollo. You can check out more of their work by visiting spayrollo.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's the number 3, on Insta. Reach out with your questions, concerns, work case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. Stephanie will personally answer every single submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for new episodes of the Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.